Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Osterhout, the executive producer here at Lincoln Square, and I'm joined, as I am every week, for one of my favorite, very dark half hours with Andra Watkins For Such a Time as This. Andra, how are you?
I'm great, Sam. How are you?
I mean, good. After reading your work this week, look, we're going to talk about Coverture today.
Yeah.
And we talked about it last week as well, but the work you're doing, like, it's, again, I always say this, that we're going to run out of white Christian nationalist stuff to talk about, but we don't because they are not stopping. And so we're going to talk about Coverture. And as dark as all of this is, there's some positive stuff that we can talk about too, and I want to get to that as well. For all of you in the audience, as we go, I'd love to hear your stories in the chat. Andrew, you did a big focus on real stories, because a lot of this stuff is not just ancient history, it's very recent history. This is in the sort of the DNA of every human walking the earth currently. So let's, I want to kind of set this up, because we talk about this a lot, but most of the rights women in this country take for granted, like owning a home or having a bank account or choosing who to marry or even leaving a marriage, these weren't secured in the 1800s or even the early 1900s. American women couldn't get a credit card until 1974, right? Like, they couldn't open a bank account without a husband's co-signature until the 1960s. Marital rape wasn't a crime in all 50 states until 1993. That is astonishing to me. And these rights were stripped by this legal doctrine, which we're talking about today, called coverture, which we also talked about last week. And it's, just as a reminder, it's a concept from English common law, holding that upon marriage, and honestly before, a woman ceased to exist as a legal person. She was absorbed into her husband. He owned her property, controlled her wages, decided where she went, and all of the dark things that come with that. She gave consent for everything just simply by saying, I do. So it wasn't a fringe idea. This, as we've said, has, it's not a nostalgic thing that the white Christian nationalists are trying to get back to. They're trying to reinforce this as a policy. So this sounds like Victorian, right? We talked about that as like being a sort of bodice ripper sort of terminology. Just start here. Your readers have been sharing family stories, the grandmothers who were institutionalized for getting angry at their husbands who were cheating, women who were locked in back bedrooms, and, excommunicated nuns. What does it mean that this is really a living memory for so many American families? And why does the exact legal term coverture, why do we need to call it coverture?
We need to call it coverture because that's what it is. And so many Americans don't understand what that is, even though if you're a woman in this society, you've been impacted by coverture, most likely. Even today, one of the stats that I looked up and published this week was that 20-something% of women are unbanked or underbanked.
Right.
And, a vast majority of those are single mothers. And those numbers get more extreme if you go into areas like the South or the Midwest, poorer areas of the country where racism may still be a real meaningful thing, because those things are enforced by race as well. So, it wasn't a big deal in my lifetime in a small town in the South for women to have to get their husband's permission to get a bank account, even though in 1974 we weren't supposed to have to do that anymore, thanks to Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the Equal, Credit Act that she worked to get passed into law. So, and she was seminal in that piece of legislation, working toward that as an attorney. So, but still, even though that was passed in 1974, it wasn't uncommon in the South. It's probably not in a lot of places in the South today for a woman to go into a bank and have the banker say, I'm not banking you because you need your husband here.
Right.
Because, the fact that these laws have been passed have not necessarily made it easier for some women to access credit and banking and investing, or to buy property in their own names if you live in certain parts of the country. And those prejudices, those behaviors are parts of coverture that have always existed in American society. Regardless of how many laws we've passed and how much progress we've made, there are still people who try to enforce that today. So there are women today who can say, well, I just tried to do something and was told I couldn't do it because I need my husband here. I need my father to co-sign or whatever.
Right. Well, so I think that's a really interesting part. And I want to talk about how coverture, the sort of misogyny of coverture and racism are really bound up in a minute, because Elon Musk obviously has something to say about this as well. But as in terms of this sort of cultural thread, we have this guy. I'm looking for his name now. Oh God, he's the worst. There's the political scientist named Scott Yenor.
Yes.
He now runs one of the Heritage Foundation's major policy centers. He said publicly that employers should hire only male heads of households, right? He has called professional women medicated, meddlesome, and quarrelsome. He gave a speech at a national conference arguing that engineering schools, medical schools, and law schools should stop recruiting women altogether, and that if every Nobel Prize winner is a man, that's, in his words, kind of a cause for celebration. And in fact, Heritage's own vice president called him too controversial for the Trump administration, and then they hired him anyway. So this is that cultural thread. And I think about the woman behind the counter at the bank who is afraid to give a loan or to open a bank account for another woman, especially a single mother, especially a Black single mother or a non-white single mother. That feels like it may not be codified into law that woman behind the counter can't do it, but there is a sort of cultural fear that's happening. How do men like Yenor make it to the top these days?
Well, obviously on the right, there is a long history of men, especially white men, failing upward. In South Carolina, where I grew up, we call those men the good old boys. And other areas of the country have a version of that, where there are these white men who come from certain families, and so they're always given opportunities, even though they're mediocre to just frankly ungifted and untalented. but they get opportunities because they're white men who have certain daddies and granddaddies and great granddaddies.
Yep.
That's how we talked about them in South Carolina, but that's a general theme all over the South. So these men have been schooled to believe that they're owed these things. This system of good old boy in the South, that it's called other things around the country, but this good old boy system has conditioned men to feel entitled to whatever they decide they want because they're white men with these daddies and granddaddies and great granddaddies who also were mediocre to really untalented and ungifted men who were also given things that they really didn't earn. through their skills. And so, that is what we're seeing as feminism, as women started getting more positions, started getting more university placements, started getting more jobs. And these men had to work harder, who their granddaddy and great granddaddy and all of that didn't matter as much anymore, or didn't have as much sway. These men became resentful.
Right.
And so that is how men like Scott Yenor get to the place they are. They work that system of a white man is always the best person for the job, especially if he has certain daddies and granddaddies and great granddaddies and, certain other connections to other mediocre white men.
Yep.
Who can give him a leg up. And so that's how he gets to a place that he is. Quite frankly, the Heritage Foundation and the Moral Majority, one of the things that they did really well was create this whole network of think tanks and groups that could hire these mediocre men and give them a way to fail upward and give them things to do. And so, Scott Yenor got into that kind of thing and was able to benefit from it. It's a real, this is something that's baked into the foundation of our country. So it's something we certainly need to talk about.
Yeah.
But we're not going to change it in a week or two by talking about it. This is a generations long foundational problem in our country that's going to take generations to undo.
I think that's right. And I think, I think about all the kids I grew up with, the white boys that I grew up with, not all obviously, but, I see them spouting off on Facebook about this or about that. And there's a level of certainty, right? And also an intolerance for any kind of pushback, because there is, and it's, what we've talked about in the past, that, the opposite of faith is not faithlessness, it's certainty, right? It is this belief that you are certain that something has to be true. And in this case, the certainty is the certainty of your own value and worth and righteousness, right? And I think that as our world has gotten smarter in some ways, as maybe the right way to frame that is, as women have been given more seats or taken more seats in positions of leadership, not nearly enough, by the way. As feminism has made advances for women, men are suddenly faced with their mediocrity, and the level of mediocrity, especially white men who constantly are failing upward. And it does seem like coverture or white Christian nationalism is really a framework by which they can reassert power and continue to be mediocre, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I mean, it is the framework that they're using, whether you're a white Christian nationalist man or a male supremacist man or a tech bro, Elon Musk type man. Coverture is the framework that they're using to try to say women need to be put back in the kitchen. They need to be breeding. They need to be uneducated. They need to be married right out of high school if they even finish high school. And that is the drum that is being beat in Saving America by Saving the Family, which is the Heritage Foundation's plan for the next 250 years of this country. That is the drumbeat that they have. Let's force these women, remove all other options, which they called opportunity costs. Women have too many choices, and so they're not choosing to get married. So we need to remove these choices so that they won't be able to make any other choice but getting married. And, then they won't be able to be so picky about how dreadful many of the young men are. they'll have to pick one. And so that's what's baked into Saving America by Saving the Family. That's when Nick Fuentes says all women need to be sent to breeding gulags, and the ones that breed can be let out, and the ones that don't can be put to work. That's
Charming.
another version of that belief system, and that Nick Fuentes believes that he owns every woman, that he has the right to decide that a woman is not an independent legal person with her own rights. She should be sent to a gulag because Nick Fuentes says so, is part of this system of coverture. And today I wrote about misandry and how there's a really great cover article in the Atlantic on masculinism, which is what we're talking about. This movement toward coverture is part of this movement on the right called masculinism, where men have been deprived of all the things they deserve. And so women need to be put back in their places. But what's really driving that, and she doesn't talk about this in the article, is this concept of misandry. And if you go on X or somewhere and put in hashtag misandry, you'll just read forever about how these young men, these men on these platforms, are being DARVO'd with this notion that the reason you don't have everything you deserve, man, is because women hate you. Misandry is women who hate men. So you didn't get that promotion at work. This woman got it because she went in there and shook her ass and charmed everybody. And so, she used her feminine wiles to get this promotion, and she's laughing at you because she was able to do that to you, and she hates you. You're still living in your parents' basement, and you look across the street at this woman who just bought the house across the street, and she hates you, and she's laughing at you every day when she comes out and gets in her new car that you can't afford because you're living in your parents' house. It's her fault that you can't get a house because she hates you. That is, and it's a psyop. It's a way to convince these men that their problems aren't self-created. I didn't score high enough on the entrance exam to get the university place, and that's why I didn't get in. This other woman got in because she went in and did some woo-woo on the committee, and so she got my place, and she's laughing at me, and she hates me. And so I hate her too. That is what is being done in a lot of these online spaces to especially young men.
Yes.
Telling them that women hate them, and that's why they have all the problems they do.
Well, and there are a couple of things I want to talk through in what you just said, but I think it's also worth mentioning that in these white boys like mind, it doesn't matter who earned anything; they deserve. Right. They deserve, and it's not. I don't believe that they imagine that people of color actually earn their position, or that women actually earn their positions, when in fact, the women and people of color have to work 5 times as hard as these mediocre white boys. You mentioned something called DARVO, and I want to just dial into this because I'd never actually heard of this. It's a tactic called DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. And it's a term that comes out of abuse psychology. So look, Scott Yenor, our friend Scott Yenor, I don't know if I'm saying his name right. I don't care. Sorry, Scott. He uses the word gynecocracy. Is that how you say that? It literally rule by women. And this all sort of fits together in this piece. What is DARVO?
DARVO, if you read Jim Stewartson's Substack, he talks about DARVO a lot, and he's been on Lincoln Square. He's a great resource for this kind of psychological discussion about how tech bros are using AI. So, I don't want to plug other people on here, but this is where I learned about DARVO.
That's great.
So, and if you watch Caroline Leavitt or other people in this regime, remember when Pam Bondi, or more recently Kash Patel, had to sit and be questioned in Congress, having a book that she was flipping through of what people had searched in the Epstein files was a form of DARVO. I won't answer your question. I'll deny whatever you just said outright and attack you instead with my book or my lie or my Joe Biden did or my you're a nasty person, or I'll use these attacks to then reverse the victim and the offender. I'm going to make myself into the victim instead of the offender. And so it's a very powerful tool that has been used by this crowd across multiple things. If you look at the QAnon conspiracy, there's a lot of DARVO involved. If you look at how Caroline Leavitt runs her news conferences, there's a lot of DARVO involved. If you look at how anybody from the regime answers questions, they're constantly denying the truth, attacking you, attacking whoever they feel they need to attack to deny. And then they're making themselves into the victims when they're really the offenders. They attack the victim and make them the offender. So in this situation with Misandry, that's exactly what's happening. These young men who have been schooled to believe that they're entitled to things, that they shouldn't have to work for things, that it should just fall in their laps because they're white men, have had to work harder to get things, because women and people of color will work harder to get things because they've had to. So they have the discipline to do that. And so these young men are being told to deny the fact that whatever reason that you didn't get what you thought you should get is something you didn't work hard enough for or didn't earn. Deny that, attack the person who got what you wanted, and make yourself the victim and them the offender. And that's what this messaging has been doing for, I cited a campus publication from 2023. So this is a system that they've been working for several years now with particularly young men to create this resentment, this sense of I'm not where I need to be in life because women hate me and women are taking everything from me that I deserve. And so it's really important to understand, especially if you're a young man in this chat, in this group, or have sons or younger men in your lives, that they're being exposed to a near constant buffet of these talking points.
Yeah. Look, I think, man, I think it's worth mentioning that this system has been in place for hundreds of years already, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is not a new thing, but there is this wild resurgence, which you've been reporting on for a couple of years. And it's not a resurgence per se, it's a codification of the sort of white culture and the white male culture, right? It is saying, like, we can no longer just expect women to behave because that's how our culture operates. Now we need to make it a legal situation. And I think about when I was about to go to college, and all the dads and moms in my town, we go to graduation parties, they were like, "You gonna rush a frat?" I was like, "I don't think so." And they were like, "Well, how do you expect to get a job?" And I was like, "Well, I'm just gonna be good enough." And they were like, "Oh, haha, right, gotcha." and I think back on that, it was never about being good enough, right? It was only about your identity, who you knew, who you rubbed shoulders with, and what inside, like, racist and sexist and misogynist inside jokes you were able to keep from the women in your lives, right? There's always, I've talked to friends about this, there was always some dude in your group who you would go out for dinner with all the couples, and the women get up to go to the bar, go to the bathroom, and there's one guy who, like, starts making sexist comments about the waitress, like, as soon as the women are gone, right? All of this stuff has been so encoded, and it's not all men. Like, many of us find that abhorrent and disgusting and even call it out when it happens. But it's worth, I think, mentioning now that, 2/3 of young men now regularly engage with masculinity influencers online who are pushing this vision. The irony now is that this isn't just about women causing men, young men and men's failure. It's that the ability for, oh, sorry, there's that. I hate
I can do it too. Maybe it'll work for me. No, it's not.
I gotta turn that off. But we'll keep that in. But that it's not just, women's success. It's women voting. It's women having bank accounts. It's women being able to leave their marriages when they're being abused. That's what these white men are believing is the cause of all of their problems. Mm-hmm. How do we move forward?
I mean, one of the stats in the Atlantic article that has stuck with me is 80% of Republican men under the age of 50 in the United States believe that the United States is too feminine. Ugh. And that this feminization of the United States is a real problem. So how do we move forward? It's great to see masculinism and so many of the drivers of it that you and I have been talking about and pointing to for some time now be called out in a publication like The Atlantic, and not in some sort of, these are weird, eccentric little people that we shouldn't take seriously, but with gravitas, with these men are serious, they have lots of influence. She does a very good job in that article. So it's good to see that, but it really doesn't get underneath one of the key root causes of this, which is this online sphere where these men are being DARVO'd all the time with this notion that women hate them. And that's why they should be angry with women and want to put women back in the kitchen and back into breeding situations. I think it's really important, if we have young men in our lives, to, especially if you're a man, to open up conversation pathways with those young men and try to figure out what they're thinking and where they're at on that spectrum. Have they been hearing these terms in the spaces they hang out online? What do they think of them? How can you put different kinds of information in front of them to try to undo this psychological operation that's happening in these spaces where men are being taught that they're the real victims of women and of feminism, very aggressively and in a very sophisticated manner? It would be really helpful to get to the bottom of what some of the young men in our lives are really thinking about that, how much of that they believe, what they point to justify it, so that we can start coming up with talking points to try to diffuse a bunch of that, because it's going to be up to us to try to dig into what are these young men being told and why is this so compelling to them. And the people who have the most chance of making a difference are the people who have a relationship already with a particular young man. So reaching out and having those conversations and trying to get to the bottom of where on this spectrum different young men in our lives are could be a really good way to start trying to address this in our culture.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, listening is important. If you're a grown man and young men, listening and modeling, right? Modeling actual behavior. I think it's very tempting for a middle-aged man, I've heard, to try to appear to be very cool, for the younger men that in their lives. I think you have to be super cool with who you are and model that particular behavior. Mm-hmm. And it comes from a confidence in yourself, and also understanding that you are who you are, regardless of who anyone else is, right? Like somebody else's failure shouldn't be the thing that lifts you up.
Well, and isn't that what weakness is?
It's
This
totally weakness,
brand of masculinity that's being sold today is weak and pathetic. And more men of strength, which is confidence, not arrogance, but confidence. I know who I am. I know what I value. I know what's important. And I'm going to live those values and model that. And I don't care if it's not popular, and I don't care if I get made fun of. Who cares about that? You know, that's what real masculinity and strength to me is. So it's really important for men who possess those qualities to model that and talk about that. And even in groups where men start acting out, to call that out.
Yeah.
And not just in a passive way, but to actively call it out and say, that offends me. And this is why this is wrong. And this is why this is unacceptable. And do it in front of all the men standing there snickering. You know, it's really important that more men start standing up to this, especially, and modeling better behavior for younger men.
I think the modeling is so essential. And I think, look, you know, any of these codes or cultural codes or mores or anything is not enforced through reason and rationality, right? It's always enforced through, at the foundational level, through violence. Mm-hmm. The fact that men are bigger is everything, right? That is it. And it also is why it's so, it feels so immovable, because as a man, like, I understand the quick trigger to violence. You understand it the second you get to school. As a 5-year-old, you understand how violent little boys can be and how quick they are to that. And it doesn't change as we get old. There's a instability in that. And so calling out your dude friends or dude acquaintances or your shitty uncle is scary, because there is always a burbling, sort of smoldering baseline of violence that is just under the surface. You got to push through that.
Yeah, you do.
And I don't want to open a total can of worms, but I think this is really tied in and worth discussing. So 5 states, because this is the result of what we're talking about here, the legislative result. So 5 states have introduced legislation to eliminate no-fault divorce. Several states have passed what they're calling covenant marriage laws, marriages with no meaningful path to exit. J.D. Vance and Mike Johnson have both been vocal about what they see as the problem of divorce being too easy.
Too easy, yeah.
Too easy. And you've written that the campaign against no-fault divorce is actually a campaign against all divorce. It's not just...
Because in these churches, you're not allowed, when a woman goes to the church and says, my husband cheated on me, which biblically, you know, if we want to go back to, I'm getting a biblical divorce, which Ken Paxton's wife says she filed for because he committed adultery on her. But, you know, in a lot of these churches, women will say, my husband cheated on me. And the church council will say, well, he's apologized and he's cried and he's sorry. And he says he won't do it again. So we're not going to.
And maybe if you just weren't so obstinate or crabby.
Right. Maybe if you just submitted to him more and wore nicer clothes and fixed your hair better and lost some weight and didn't nag him, he wouldn't be looking elsewhere. So, you know, we think you ought to go back and try again because he said he's sorry and he asked for your forgiveness. And so in practice, that's how a lot of this works in these churches. And men like Mike Johnson would apply that attitude to the law. So even though in theory they are just going after no-fault divorce, in practice they are going to make it nigh impossible to get any kind of divorce for a woman. And we've talked about that before, but it's worth retreading really quickly.
Well, I think because that's where all of this leads. And this is what we're really talking about, this sort of cultural impulse to control women being codified in our state and also federal laws. And just the warning that these people are in position to make those laws, right? So none of this is hypothetical. You always talk about how you're afraid you're like a crazy lady screaming from the rooftops. But that's the first step in solving this problem. And that's, I think, where, I would really love to kind of wrap this up. Let's talk about if 1 million women did one thing tomorrow that changed the dial, what would it be?
Wow, that's a great question. I will admit that even though I grew up in white Christian nationalism, even though I was conditioned to accept this societal structure of coverture and to defer to men, I will admit that as I have deconstructed from all of that, I take some of my freedoms for granted as a woman. It's easy to forget once you don't have to carry around that load all the time, that those freedoms could be taken away. So it's really imperative that every woman wake up every day and realize my freedoms are recent.
Yeah.
They are not guaranteed. And I have to take these threats to them seriously. And so many women aren't doing that. Well, I live in a blue state and I don't have to worry about this. Well, my state has protected contraception in our Constitution, so I don't have to worry about that. That's a red woman problem, red state problem. I don't have to worry about that. And that's not true. Every woman, democracy is a daily job. We have to work for that every day. But as women, we also have to realize that our freedoms are things that we have to safeguard and defend and fight for every day. And so that's what I'm doing. Part of doing this is doing that. But all women must do that. And so if I could tell women to do one thing, that's what it would be. What did I do today to try to make sure that I can have the same rights and freedoms tomorrow that I have today?
And that my daughters can grow up in a world where they can one day forget about all of it.
Yes. Even though I don't know that we'll ever live in that world. That's one of the things that I think this period should teach us. We always have to work to protect and defend the freedoms we have. There's never going to be a day where we're going to be able to say we have arrived.
Well, we will work towards that, and fight. We have to fight, and I think that's a great place to wrap this. I can't wait to see what you write about next week. Everyone, you have to subscribe to For Such a Time as This on Substack. It's Andra's really incredible and illuminating Substack. And I think really that is the first step in this fight, is arming yourself with knowledge, knowing what you're up against, knowing where to put your energy. It can feel very overwhelming. And having information like the stuff and the incredible writing and work that Andra does is that's armor. That's armor for you. Andra, I appreciate you.
I appreciate you too. This is some of my favorite time of the week, even though it's dark. Me too.
Yeah, I know. Well, we will see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.